Arguments and contracts. We all know that normally these two words go together pretty well, because as soon as you have a contract, there most likely will be an argument, which words to put in. Then you have a version, then the other side has a version, and you then send it back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, until you either completely ignore what's in the contract, or it became so complicated that no one actually understands what's in there. And we also know that this is a big business. And today we have someone who is fully legally qualified, was a lawyer for 20 years, and now does the exact opposite. Hello and welcome, Sarah Fox.
Hi, Niels.
So great to talk to you. Thank you very much for taking the time. So your business is about simple construction contracts. And when I hear the word simple and contract in the same phrase, and then put construction in the middle of the phrase, how can a construction contract, and I know that your tagline is 500 words, how do you want to make a construction contract that simple?
So it's a really good question, because I struggled with whether or not it was possible when the idea first came to me. But I have had a background in reading, reviewing, adapting, negotiating, litigating contracts. And then I started to train people on construction contracts. And I realized that pretty much every single person that I trained on construction contracts, whether they were lawyers, procurement managers, contractors, consultants, funders, didn't understand what they were signing up to. So we've got these massive, as you say, it's an industry in itself, this massively long contract, which then effectively gets shoved in a drawer and nobody pays any attention to. And even if they did get it out, they couldn't understand what it said, so they couldn't actually follow it. So it just seemed to me a massive wasted opportunity to do something which actually worked for the project, for the parties, for the businesses involved.
So when you say you train people on it, so you are a fully qualified lawyer. When you make things more simple, maybe I just missed something, but as a lawyer, you get paid by the hour. So when you make something more simple, you invoice less hours.
Well, that would be the logical conclusion, but I don't pay. I don't charge by the hour, because actually, for me, a client isn't interested in the paper, the weight of it, the length of it, the words in it. They're interested in the project. So the paper is just a tool to help them do the project, like a hammer or any other sort of tool that they have, a technical tool of any sort. So if I'm only focusing on my tool being brilliant, well, they're not at the moment. They're really not good tools. They don't help people do projects. They don't help the parties to build relationships. They don't manage the project as it goes. So actually, what I'm providing them with is just a very expensive brick.
So when you started to offer that on the market, it will not make you hugely popular amongst lawyers, does it?
Well, it's interesting, because publicly, many of the lawyers say, oh, A, you can't do it because that's too simple. There's obviously going to be holes. B, we like the idea of providing long contracts because we can charge by the hour and we can make more money. But privately, a lot of them say, the idea of not having to spend another day arguing about clause 37.2.5.b, which is about something that will never get used and is quite a technical legal point and all that kind of stuff, and arguing about red lines and amendments and tweaks and commas and stuff like that. They actually would rather do more strategic legal advice that helps a business than argue about the nitty-gritty and dotting the I's and crossing the T's.
So when you now approach companies, are they open for the idea? Because I know that many companies in the construction area, let's put it that way, the construction industry is not known to be on the frontier of innovation when it comes to changing fundamental aspects of their business. So most construction companies will have done it the complicated way for most likely decades. So when you walk through the door and say it's all a lot more simple than you think, are they open for the idea? Because of course when something goes wrong in construction, there is a very high legal liability coming with it.
Yes. So there's a couple of things that we need to take into account with the construction industry. First is they're extremely pragmatic. Most of the people in construction industry just want to get buildings built, infrastructure done, energy plants. even if a domestic extension. So they're interested in the outputs. They've never gone into their projects because of the paperwork. And in fact, they don't like the paperwork. A third of construction projects in the UK start without a contract being in place. That's how much we don't like them. Yeah. Wow. So that's about £33 billion worth of work every year in the UK. So we know they don't like contracts. So if you could give them something which took less time to review, to negotiate, to sign, if they could read it on their phone, then most of them are up for it. And this may not be the big global buyers of construction services like the Amazons and the Googles and doing their headquarters. But we have about 350,000 small and micro enterprises in UK construction, and they are currently doing things effectively on the back of a napkin, or they've cobbled something together off the internet. And if you could provide them with a simple but robust legal tool rather than something they've kind of mushed up, then they're very open to this idea of something that protects them, that is simple, but that doesn't annoy the other side. Because that's a problem with the long contracts. They create this sort of barrier to doing business rather than smoothing the business transaction.
So when you have a very long contract and you want to make it a short contract, how do you know which parts to leave out?
Well, the first thing you always ask them is, what do you use this contract for? Do you use it just to sue them at the other side, or do you use it as the project progresses? So what's the main purpose of the contract? The second thing is to kind of look at what differs from project to project. And let's try and put all that somewhere separate, because that's so project specific. We can't put generic terms in. But what we do is focus on what's needed for this project, what changes behaviours, rather than what just tells them what they've always done. What changes behaviours? What processes do they need to, manage the changes that happen on projects? And a really good example of this, Niels, is what's happened in the last year in terms of the COVID pandemic. When it first struck in the UK, almost all the people on construction projects got out their contracts, really long, complicated contracts, flicked through them, tried to find the answer, realised there wasn't anything that actually had the answer, and then began to wonder why they'd bothered with these contracts in the first place, because they weren't flexible enough to deal with it or specific enough to refer to it. And at that point, they're beginning to scratch their heads thinking, okay, this doesn't actually respond to things that we didn't expect, the unexpected. So maybe we aren't focusing on the right areas when we write these contracts.
So when we talk about these contracts in the construction industry, doesn't the same apply to many other contracts outside the construction industry as well? If we think of, for example, purchasing departments of larger organizations, they often have hundreds and hundreds of pages. And when I talk to business owners, they always say, in case of an argument, we always sit together and just find a deal. No one sticks to that contract. However, they still produce 250 pages up front, negotiate 3 months over it before they then sign it and then don't stick to it. So isn't that an approach that other industries should take into account as well?
Absolutely. And there's certainly been a drive globally for consumer contracts. So there's quite a lot of legislation around the world, in South Africa and America and the UK and Europe, which asks for consumer contracts to be simple, fair and transparent. And some of that is building into other sectors. And I've worked with an Italian energy firm. I'm currently working with a UK company, looking at how we can simplify their contracts. I'm doing that through a collaboration with other people, because the same principles that I've applied to construction contracts apply to any contract. You kind of strip it back and say, a lot of stuff have kind of appeared in this contract over the years, and the internet and word processing is a really good reason why we've done that, because it's so easy to copy and paste stuff. But the idea is that we need to strip things back to make their processes quicker, more efficient, because if they're going to use their existing relationships to solve disputes, which most companies do, there's absolutely no point in tying down their contractors, their suppliers, and everyone else with kind of really complicated legal knots, when they could just say, I tell you what, we'll sit down and resolve it. So let's just have a transactional based agreement, which is clear, easy, transparent, and just gets us from A, which is before we signed a contract, to B, which we all need for our governance. And then we can just not worry about all that legal stuff that we've packed in it for those years.
Excellent. So when people are now listening to this podcast and they think that's actually a good idea, I think we should get started. The question always is is there something where I can look something up? So, for example, the many important documents start with, for example, the usual letter of intent, a very important document. And letter of intent goes from 1 line to 10 pages or somewhere in between. Or, for example, when you book consultants and you try to describe what they do, how they should do it, are there any documents or anything which you publish people could stick to?
So I've written a couple of books, and I've put sample documents onto my website, which is just 500 words.co.uk. So people can see samples of things, so they can begin to understand the new normal. There's also the World Commerce and Contracting have a contract pattern library, which gives you ideas of how you can not just write contracts differently, but also you can display them in a way that makes sense, that draws people in, that encourages people to read them. And there are lots of people around the world who are doing different types of contracts. There's a chap in South Africa who does visual contracts for people who don't have the same language as the client. So there's all sorts of different examples of really good contract design, contract simplification, and legal design, all of which combine to make contracts more visually appealing, but also just as legally robust as they currently are.
So when people are now listening to this, and this is great advice, really. So when people are now listening to this and they think, I really want to change the approach my organization has. However, I am not on the board of directors. I am not in a senior leadership position. To round this interview up, how can people start this change in their organization? What are your top tips for people who are not in charge, not senior leaders, but they want to give this innovation, this better approach a chance in their organization? How to start the change?
Well, I think one of the ways to do it is to try and record and start to get some data about how much time, effort, and energy is currently put into the current contracting regime. Because as soon as you can say, I may not be senior, but I've just done a straw poll amongst the people who work on contracting in this team. And over the last month, this is how much time, effort, and energy and external costs we've spent trying to get contracts agreed that we know that we're never going to enforce. If we did things differently, if we put that money up front into simpler transactions, then this would save the business however much over the next 5 years. And I think, senior leaders respond to ideas that are strategically important or profit-based. The other thing to do is to look at the values of your company. If you have a value of transparency and supplier friendliness and innovation, then actually contracts are part of that innovation, supplier friendliness, transparency. And if you have all those sorts of values, but you're not living them from the day you get a supplier on board to the end of the transaction, then actually your contracts are really damaging your business's reputation. So there's different ways of finding out a way to make the simplification of contracts part of the strategic value to a business. And you just have to find the hook that gets people interested.
Excellent. These are perfect final words for this podcast. So I'm going to put your contact data in the show notes of this podcast so people can, of course, contact you directly if they have any further ideas. And of course, which I would highly recommend, book you for speaking, coaching, or giving workshops in their organization. So at the end of this at the end of this podcast, there's only one thing for me left to say. Sarah, thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome. And thank you for encouraging people to keep things simple.